Hello, travelers of time. Welcome back to another journey into the shadows of history. Before we begin tonight, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. There's something magical about knowing that all across the globe, people are settling in to explore the same moment in history together. If this is your first time here, welcome. Consider subscribing, because we create these stories specifically to help you unwind, to transform history from dry facts into something intimate and comforting. And if you're returning, thank you. Your presence here means everything. Tonight, we're stepping into medieval Europe during the most dangerous, most sacred, most misunderstood night of the year. You think you know Halloween? You think carved pumpkins and candy represent what this night once meant? Prepare to discover a world where Halloween wasn't a celebration. It was a survival ritual, where the church battled ancient beliefs, where the living genuinely feared the dead, and where a single misstep on this night could cost you your soul. So settle in, dim the lights, get comfortable under your blankets, because we're traveling back to medieval Halloween, and nothing about it looks like what you'd expect. Picture this. It's October 31st, sometime around the year 1350. You're a peasant in a small English village. As darkness falls, the church bells ring out. Not in celebration, but in warning. Your priest has spent weeks telling you that tonight, hell itself opens, that demons walk freely, that the souls of the damned seek bodies to possess. Outside your window, you see your neighbors doing something that would be unthinkable any other night of the year. They're setting out food for the dead, carving grotesque faces into turnips, dressing in animal skins and masks, performing rituals the church officially condemns but unofficially tolerates, because everyone knows, everyone fears what happens if you don't. This is medieval Halloween, and it's about to get much stranger. To understand what Halloween was really like in medieval times, we need to understand that medieval Europe existed in a constant state of spiritual tension. Two belief systems were locked in an uneasy coexistence: Christianity and the older pagan traditions that Christianity had never quite managed to eliminate. By the medieval period, roughly 500 to 1500 CE, Christianity had officially conquered Europe. Every kingdom was Christian. Every person was baptized. Churches dominated the landscape. But beneath this Christian surface, ancient beliefs persisted, especially surrounding death and the supernatural. The medieval worldview was fundamentally different from ours. To a medieval person, the supernatural wasn't superstition, it was reality. Angels and demons actively intervened in daily life. Saints performed miracles. The devil personally tempted Christians. And the dead didn't simply cease to exist. They remained dangerously present. This brings us to Halloween, or as the church called it, All Hallows Eve, the night before All Saints' Day on November 1st. The church had established All Saints' Day in the 8th century, strategically placing it on November 1st to coincide with and eventually replace Samhain, the ancient Celtic festival of the dead. The plan was to Christianize the pagan celebration, to transform it from a night of fear and supernatural danger into a solemn religious observance honoring Christian martyrs. It didn't work. Not really. Instead, what emerged was a fascinating hybrid. A night that was officially Christian but remained deeply pagan in practice. The church provided the theological framework, but ordinary people continued the old ways, often with tacit approval from local priests who understood that some traditions ran too deep to eliminate. Medieval Europe on the eve of All Hallows was a landscape of contradictions. In cities like London, Paris, and Rome, stone churches dominated the skylines, their bells marking the hours, their rituals structuring daily life. But step outside those cities into the villages, into the deep forests, onto the isolated farms, and you'd find a different world. A world where Christian prayers mixed freely with ancient charms, where people attended Mass in the morning and consulted wise women about protective spells in the evening. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe throughout the 14th century, had intensified everyone's relationship with death. By 1350, 1/3 of Europe's population had died, perhaps 25 million people. Death wasn't abstract. It was everywhere. Bodies piled in streets. Mass graves scarred the landscape. Entire villages stood empty. This made Halloween, already a night focused on death and the supernatural, even more psychologically powerful. When you've watched half your family die of plague, when you've seen corpses rotting in the streets, the idea that the dead might return on Halloween doesn't seem like folklore. It seems terrifyingly plausible. The medieval year was structured around the agricultural calendar, and Halloween marked a crucial transition point. The harvest was complete. All crops that could be saved were stored away. Livestock that couldn't be fed through winter had been slaughtered, their meat preserved. The land lay dormant. Winter approached with its promise of cold, darkness, and death. This transition from light to dark, from life to death, from abundance to scarcity, gave Halloween its psychological power. It was a threshold moment, and medieval people believed that at threshold moments, at doorways, at crossroads, at dawn and dusk, at the turning of seasons, the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds grew thin. On Halloween night, that boundary didn't just thin. They believed it dissolved completely. Let's start with what the church wanted Halloween to be, because understanding the official position helps us appreciate how differently ordinary people actually observed the night. The medieval Catholic Church taught that All Hallows Eve should be spent in solemn preparation for All Saints' Day. Ideally, Christians would fast, attend evening prayer services, contemplate mortality, and prepare spiritually to honor the saints. Parish priests would deliver sermons emphasizing Christian themes: the communion of saints, the resurrection of the dead, the final judgment. They'd remind their congregations that death, while fearful, was not the end, that Christian souls awaited resurrection, that the saints interceded for the living, that proper devotion ensured salvation. Some churches held all-night vigils. Parishioners would gather in the church as darkness fell, lighting candles before images of saints, praying for the dead, singing hymns. The church building itself became a fortress of light against the dangerous darkness outside, a sacred space where the demons supposedly loose on Halloween night couldn't enter. Wealthier churches would display relics, the bones or belongings of saints, which were believed to hold protective power. Pilgrims might journey specifically to visit famous relics on All Hallows Eve, believing that the saint's power was particularly potent on this night. The church also promoted the practice of praying for souls in purgatory. Medieval theology held that most souls spent time in purgatory after death, being purified before entering heaven. The living could help these souls through prayer, and All Hallows Eve was considered an especially powerful time for such intercession. Some churches rang bells throughout the night, not just to call the faithful to prayer, but because bells were believed to drive away evil spirits. The sound of consecrated church bells created a protective sonic barrier against supernatural threats. This was the official, church-approved Halloween. Solemn, spiritual, focused on Christian salvation. But here's what actually happened in medieval villages and towns, far from the watchful eyes of bishops and ecclesiastical authorities. While the church promoted prayer and fasting, ordinary medieval people were preparing for Halloween in ways that would have horrified church authorities, if those authorities hadn't been quietly participating themselves. As October 31st approached, families began preparations that mixed Christian ritual with ancient protective magic. Women would bake soul cakes, small round cakes made with spices like nutmeg and cinnamon, marked with a cross. Officially, these were Christian symbols. In practice, they served multiple purposes that had nothing to do with church teaching. Soul cakes would be left out for the dead. Medieval people genuinely believed their deceased relatives returned on Halloween night, and they wanted these visits to be peaceful. So they'd set places at the table for dead family members, leaving out food and drink, bread, beer, sometimes the dead person's favorite meal. This wasn't metaphorical. They believed the spirits would actually consume the essence of the food. But you couldn't just feed your own dead. You had to appease all the wandering spirits, especially the dangerous ones. So families would leave soul cakes on doorsteps, at crossroads, at the edges of their property, anywhere a spirit might pass. This practice gave rise to souling, one of Halloween's most interesting medieval traditions. Groups of poor people, often children, would go door to door on Halloween night, singing songs and offering to pray for the household's dead in exchange for soul cakes. This was the direct ancestor of trick-or-treating, but it was far more complex than our modern version. The Solars wore costumes, and here's where things get dark. These weren't cute costumes. They were disguises, often involving masks, animal skins, or face blackening with soot. The purpose was twofold: to hide the Solars' identity and to resemble the spirits supposedly walking abroad that night. There was an implied threat in souling. The masked figures at your door might be neighbors' children, or they might be something else. Better give them soul cakes. Better treat them well, because if you didn't, the consequences could be supernatural. In some regions, souling groups would perform crude plays depicting the battle between good and evil, life and death. One popular routine involved a mock death and resurrection. One solar would die, others would mourn, then he'd spring back to life. This ritualized death and rebirth, enacted on a night when the dead supposedly walked, served to symbolically control death itself. But souling was only the beginning of Halloween's folk practices. Medieval people carved turnips and beets. Pumpkins didn't exist in Europe yet, creating lanterns with grotesque faces. These weren't decorations. They were spiritual weapons. The carved faces were meant to be so horrible, so nightmare-inducing, that they'd frighten evil spirits away. People would place these lanterns in windows, at doors, along paths, anywhere spirits might enter. The flickering candlelight inside the carved turnip created shadows that made the grotesque face seem alive, moving, watching. Walking through a medieval village on Halloween night would mean navigating paths lined with these demon-faced lanterns, their hollow eyes following you in the darkness. Fire was central to Halloween celebrations, continuing the ancient Celtic tradition of Samhain bonfires. Villages would build enormous communal fires, and people would gather around them as darkness fell. The fire served multiple purposes. It was a source of light against the dangerous darkness, a place of community safety, and a supernatural barrier that demons supposedly couldn't cross. Young people would jump over the flames for good luck, or more accurately, to prove they hadn't been possessed by evil spirits, since the possessed supposedly couldn't cross fire. Cattle were led around the fire, or between two fires, to purify and protect them for winter. People would take embers from the communal bonfire to relight their hearth fires at home, believing this sacred flame would protect their households. But perhaps the strangest Halloween tradition involved divination, attempting to see the future, particularly regarding death and marriage. Young women would perform elaborate rituals to glimpse their future husbands. One involved peeling an apple in one continuous strip, then throwing the peel over their left shoulder. Supposedly it would land in the shape of their future husband's initial. Others would eat an apple while standing before a mirror at midnight, hoping to see their future husband's reflection appear behind them in the glass. These divination rituals sound playful, but they had a darker undercurrent. Halloween was a night when the normal rules didn't apply, when the future could be seen because time itself became fluid. To perform divination on Halloween was to risk attracting supernatural attention, to essentially knock on the door between worlds and hope something answered. Men would perform divination too, though their concerns were typically about death rather than marriage. Would they survive the winter? Would the harvest last? Would illness come? Various methods involved interpreting signs in fire, in water, in the behavior of animals. All of this would have been condemned as witchcraft by the church, and sometimes was, but on Halloween night the rules were suspended. The church's response to these folk practices was complicated. Officially, bishops and theologians condemned them as superstitious paganism. Sermons railed against carved turnips, bonfires, disguises, and especially divination. Canon law threatened excommunication for practicing magic. But local parish priests, who lived among their congregations and often came from the same peasant backgrounds, were much more tolerant. Many priests participated in or tacitly approved these traditions, recognizing that they served important social and psychological functions. Some even argued that practices like soul cakes and prayers for the dead were consistent with Christian charity, even if their execution was somewhat unorthodox. This created a fascinating dynamic where Halloween existed in a gray area, not fully condemned, not fully approved, but universally practiced. Medieval people didn't celebrate Halloween because it was fun. They observed it because they believed the night was genuinely dangerous, and their rituals were necessary for survival. What specifically did they fear? First, the restless dead. Not all dead souls went peacefully to their rest. Medieval theology and folklore agreed that some remained bound to earth. Murder victims seeking justice, people who died with unconfessed sins, those who died sudden violent deaths without last rites. Halloween was when these troubled spirits walked. If you encountered such a spirit, the consequences could be terrible. They might possess you, driving your soul out and inhabiting your body. They might lay curses on you or your family. They might physically attack you. Medieval accounts describe spirits that could grab, hit, even strangle the living. The solution was to recognize these spirits and appease them. This is why families set places for dead relatives, to keep those specific spirits satisfied and peaceful. The broader protective magic, the carved turnips, the bonfires, the iron horseshoes hung over doors, was meant to keep the more dangerous spirits at bay. Second, demons and devils. Medieval Christians believed demons were constantly seeking opportunities to harm humanity, and Halloween represented their best opportunity. With hell supposedly open and the boundary between worlds thin, demons could range freely. Possession was a genuine terror. Medieval people regularly witnessed what we now recognize as mental illness or neurological disorders. People having seizures, speaking in strange voices, exhibiting altered personalities. To them, this was clear evidence of demonic possession, and Halloween increased the risk. Protective measures included wearing crosses, carrying holy water, and avoiding certain dangerous locations. Crossroads were particularly feared because they were threshold spaces, neither fully one place nor another, where demons gathered. Smart people avoided crossroads on Halloween night. Third, witches. Medieval witch beliefs hadn't yet reached their early modern intensity. The great witch hunts came later, but by the 14th and 15th centuries, fear of witchcraft was growing. Halloween was believed to be when witches gathered for Sabbaths, worshipping the devil and plotting harm against Christians. The stereotype of witches flying on broomsticks originates in medieval Halloween beliefs. People genuinely thought they saw women flying through the night sky on Halloween, traveling to demonic gatherings. What they probably saw were birds or shadows or nothing at all, but the belief was real and terrifying. Anyone acting suspiciously on Halloween night, especially women, risked accusation of witchcraft. This made the night particularly dangerous for marginal figures. Widows, healers, anyone who didn't fit social norms. Fourth, fairies and nature spirits. Though medieval Christianity tried to reframe these as demons, common people still believed in older supernatural beings. Forests and wild places were especially dangerous on Halloween, when the fair folk held their revels. To stumble into a fairy ring on Halloween night might mean being trapped in the fairy realm for what seemed like a single night but turned out to be years or even centuries. The precautions people took reveal how seriously they took these dangers. No one traveled alone on Halloween night if they could avoid it. People stayed indoors after dark, doors and windows locked and sealed with protective symbols. Those who had to go out carried iron. Fairies supposedly couldn't bear iron and holy relics. Children were kept close. There were stories of children who wandered out on Halloween night and disappeared, presumably taken by spirits or fairies. Even infants were in danger. Folktales spoke of changelings. Fairy children swapped for human babies, and Halloween was prime changeling season. Animals, too, needed protection. Livestock were brought into barns, which were sealed with protective symbols. Cats, especially black cats, were kept strictly indoors, as they were believed to be witches' familiars and might be stolen or killed by supernatural forces. Halloween wasn't celebrated uniformly across medieval Europe. Different regions developed distinct traditions, though all shared common themes of honoring the dead and protecting against supernatural danger. In England, particularly after the Norman conquest of 1066, Halloween blended Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Norman traditions. The nobility often held feasts on Halloween night, not religious observances, but genuinely celebratory gatherings with elaborate meals, entertainment, and games. This upper-class Halloween was considerably less fearful than the peasant version, perhaps because wealth provided psychological distance from death's immediacy. But even noble households maintained protective traditions. Castles would be blessed by priests. Guards were doubled, not just against human intruders but against supernatural ones. And even nobles participated in divination games, attempting to glimpse the future. In Scotland and Ireland, Halloween retained its strongest Celtic character. The Gaelic festival of Samhain never fully disappeared, and Scottish and Irish Halloween celebrations were notably more elaborate and intense than elsewhere. Bonfires were enormous. Disguises were more elaborate. The sense of genuine supernatural danger was more palpable. One particularly Scottish tradition involved guising, dressing in costume and performing for neighbors in exchange for food. But Scottish guisers weren't cute children. They were young men in grotesque masks and costumes who would arrive at doors after dark, performing intimidating dances or reciting ominous verses. The implied threat was clear: reward us or face bad luck. In Wales, traditions around Nos Calan Gaeaf, the night before the first day of winter, were particularly dark. Young people would build bonfires and write their names on stones, then throw the stones into the fire. In the morning, they'd search for their stone. If it was missing, they would die within the year. This morbid divination reflected Welsh Halloween's preoccupation with foretelling death. In Germanic regions, Halloween was influenced by earlier Nordic traditions. The Wild Hunt, a spectral procession of the dead, led by Odin or other supernatural figures, was believed to ride through the sky on certain nights, including Halloween. Seeing the Wild Hunt was an omen of death or disaster, so people stayed indoors, shuttered their windows, and prayed for protection. French Halloween, particularly in Brittany with its strong Celtic heritage, emphasized communication with the dead. Breton families would leave out elaborate meals for deceased relatives, then sit quietly listening for sounds that might indicate the dead had arrived. Any noise, wind, creaking wood, animal sounds, might be interpreted as the dead making their presence known. In Italy, All Hallows Eve was more fully integrated into Christian practice than elsewhere, perhaps because of the papacy's presence in Rome. Italian Halloween emphasized prayer, fasting, and preparation for All Saints' Day, with fewer of the folk magical practices common in Northern Europe. However, even in Italy, people left out food for the dead and took precautions against evil spirits. Eastern European Halloween, in Poland, Hungary, and the Slavic regions, blended Catholic All Hallows Eve with older Slavic supernatural beliefs. The emphasis was particularly strong on vampires and revenants, the restless dead who supposedly rose from graves to feed on the living. Graveyards were carefully watched on Halloween night, and people avoided them entirely if possible. Not all Halloween activities were harmless traditional practices. The night's license for unusual behavior created opportunities for genuine harm. Halloween was a night of social inversion, when normal rules were temporarily suspended. This could be liberating, but it could also be dangerous. Young men, emboldened by disguises and darkness, might commit vandalism or worse, knowing their masked costumes made identification difficult. Mischief night traditions, causing minor chaos and disruption, were tolerated on Halloween in ways they wouldn't be other times. Fences were torn down, livestock were released, property was damaged. This was supposedly the work of spirits, but everyone knew it was actually rowdy youth. The supernatural explanation provided convenient cover. More seriously, Halloween's emphasis on the supernatural made it a prime time for accusations of witchcraft. If something went wrong, a fire, a sickness, a death, it might be blamed on Halloween cursing. The accused which faced investigation, torture, and possibly execution. While the worst witch hunts came later, medieval Halloween already provided occasions for dangerous accusations. Sexual license also increased on Halloween. The darkness, the disguises, the sense that normal rules didn't apply, all created opportunities for behavior that would be scandalous in daylight. Medieval moralists condemned Halloween as a time of fornication and adultery, and they weren't entirely wrong. The church tried to impose behavioral restrictions, but enforcing them was nearly impossible when everyone was masked. Violence, too, spiked on Halloween. Old grudges might be settled, secure in the knowledge that a disguise provided anonymity. Medieval criminal records show increases in assaults and murders around All Hallows Eve, suggesting the holiday's darker aspects were real, not just folklore. Here's what makes medieval Halloween so fascinating and so strange. It reveals the fundamental tension in medieval consciousness between faith and fear, between Christian doctrine and older beliefs, between what people were supposed to believe and what they actually did believe. The church taught that demons could be defeated through faith, that prayer provided protection, that Christian souls were safe from supernatural harm. And medieval people did believe this to a point. They genuinely believed in Christianity's power. But they also believed in things Christianity condemned. In the power of carved turnips to ward off evil, in the necessity of appeasing wandering spirits with food, in protective charms and magical spells that had nothing to do with Christian theology. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was psychological survival. Medieval life was harsh, brutal, and short. Death was everywhere. Half of children died before age 5. Plague could kill a third of the population in months. Violence was endemic. Starvation was always near. In such a world, people needed every tool they could get. Christian prayers and pagan charms, holy water and iron horseshoes, church blessings and ancient spells. Halloween, as the night when the boundary between life and death dissolved, became a focal point for this desperate spiritual scrambling. The medieval Halloween reveals that for ordinary people, survival mattered more than theological consistency. Yes, the priest said these folk practices were sinful superstition. But the priest also lived in a stone church with thick walls, had regular meals, and didn't have to watch his children die of hunger or disease. The peasant in his drafty hut, watching his family struggle through another harsh winter, hearing the wind howl outside on Halloween night and believing, really believing, that spirits walked in that darkness. He was going to carve that turnip. He was going to set out that food. He was going to do whatever seemed to work, whatever his grandmother did, whatever kept his family safe. Medieval Halloween wasn't about fun or celebration. It was about facing the terror of death and darkness and the unknown, and trying, through whatever means available, to survive. When you understand what Halloween really meant to medieval people, our modern celebrations seem simultaneously laughable and poignant. Laughable because we've transformed genuine terror into entertainment. We've taken practices born from authentic fear, the carved faces, the costumes, the offerings of food, and turned them into party decorations and children's games. The demons and spirits that medieval people desperately tried to ward off are now cute cartoons on candy packages. But poignant because beneath the commercialization, we're still performing the same rituals, still enacting the same impulses that drove our medieval ancestors. Every jack-o'-lantern on a porch is a descendant of those turnip lanterns, meant to scare away evil. Every child trick-or-treating in costume echoes those medieval solars, going door to door in disguise. Every Halloween party where we play at being ghosts or demons or monsters reflects that medieval impulse to confront death by playing with it, by making it familiar, by controlling it through ritual. Even our Halloween decorations, the skeletons, the tombstones, the images of death everywhere, continue the medieval practice of making death visible, of acknowledging it rather than hiding from it. Modern Western culture usually segregates death, hiding it away in hospitals and funeral homes, rarely speaking of it. But on Halloween, for one night, we bring death into our homes, into our streets, into our celebrations. We let children dress as skeletons and ghosts. We decorate with images of death. We tell scary stories. This is psychologically healthy, and medieval people understood this. By confronting death symbolically, by playing with our fears in a controlled way, we make those fears less overwhelming. Halloween provides a social structure for processing our awareness of mortality. The medieval emphasis on remembering the dead also persists, though we've largely forgotten it. All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, November 1st and 2nd, are still observed in Catholic and some Protestant traditions. People still visit graves of loved ones, still light candles for the dead, still pray for departed souls. In Mexico and Latin America, Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, maintains the medieval Halloween spirit more faithfully than modern American Halloween does. The practice of building elaborate altars for dead family members, leaving their favorite foods and drinks, believing they return to visit, this is precisely what medieval Europeans did on All Hallows Eve. Some modern pagan and Wiccan groups have reclaimed Halloween as Samhain, attempting to celebrate it as the ancient Celts supposedly did, with bonfires and rituals honoring the dead and acknowledging the cycle of life and death in nature. While these modern reconstructions aren't historically accurate, we don't actually know exactly how ancient Celts celebrated. They're trying to recover something of Halloween's original sacred character. Even our horror entertainment industry owes something to medieval Halloween. The entire genre of horror, films, novels, TV shows, performs the same cultural function as medieval Halloween stories. They let us experience fear in a controlled way, confront death and danger through fiction, process our anxieties about mortality through narrative. The medieval belief that Halloween was a dangerous night when normal rules didn't apply has modern echoes in how we treat the holiday. It's the one night when it's acceptable for children to approach strangers' homes after dark, when wearing masks and disguises is encouraged, when pretending to be monsters is celebrated. We've retained that sense of Halloween as a liminal time when boundaries dissolve, even if we no longer believe those boundaries are supernatural. There's something profound here. Medieval Halloween wasn't just about superstition or ignorance. It was about acknowledging fundamental truths. That death exists, that life is fragile, that darkness falls, that we need rituals to face our fears together. In our modern, supposedly rational world, we've lost something of that honest confrontation with mortality. We pretend death doesn't exist, that medical science will save us, that we can avoid thinking about it. But on Halloween, for one night, we remember. And maybe that's the real legacy of medieval Halloween. Not the specific beliefs about demons and spirits, but the understanding that we need communal rituals to face our deepest fears, that confronting death through symbol and ceremony makes us stronger, and that the darkest night requires the brightest fires. So as Halloween approaches this year, remember what this night once meant. Remember the medieval peasant setting out soul cakes for wandering spirits, not because he was ignorant or superstitious, but because he genuinely believed his family's safety depended on it. Remember the carved turnip with its demon face, meant to frighten away forces of evil. Remember the bonfire lighting up the darkness. People gathered around its warmth and protection, finding courage together. Our ancestors weren't foolish. They were facing the same darkness, the same fear of death, the same existential terror that we face. They just lacked our ability to distract ourselves from it. They had to confront it directly every day, and Halloween was their annual ritual for doing so collectively. We've lost much of that direct confrontation with death and darkness. But perhaps we've also lost something valuable, the acknowledgement that fear is real, that darkness exists, that death comes for us all, and that we need each other to face these truths. Medieval Halloween reminds us that rituals matter, that communities matter, that facing our fears together is how humans survive not just physically but psychologically. The next time you carve a pumpkin or hand candy to a child in a costume, take a moment to appreciate the depth of tradition you're participating in. You're part of a ritual that stretches back centuries, that has survived the transformation from genuine terror to entertainment, that connects you to countless generations of humans who gathered together in the darkness and decided to light a fire. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight, travelers of time. I hope this exploration of medieval Halloween has given you a new appreciation for the holiday's depth and meaning. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing for more history that transforms the past into something intimate and meaningful. And let me know in the comments. Knowing what Halloween truly meant to medieval people, how will you think about the holiday differently this year? Until next time, sleep well. Dream of bonfires in the darkness, of communities gathering for protection, of rituals that connect us across centuries. And remember, the spirits our ancestors feared may not be real, but the human need for light in the darkness absolutely is.